Okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Nest, and I'm the moderator for today's session. I'm a volunteer with HandUp Congo, which is the organization that has organized today's event, Congo's Cobalt, in everything, everywhere, all the time. Personally, I'm speaking to you from Canada, where today is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of ancestral lands all over the world, to which we are connected, even though we're meeting virtually. And I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people present today for today's event. Today, I'm being assisted by Fergus Ewington, who is working behind the scenes and assisting with moderating the chat and the Q&A. And I'd just like to do some housekeeping before we start. If you can't hear the presentation, first check the volume on your computer. That may be the problem. If you still have any problems or questions, please post those in the chat and Fergus will respond. At the end of the session today, after roughly 40 minutes, we will have a Q&A session, and please post your questions in the chat to have your question asked as well. If you want to save things that appear in the chat, for example, we'll post some links or references, you should be able to go to the three dots in the bar of your Zoom and click Save Chat. Fergus, you may consider putting instructions to do that in the chat itself. HandUp Congo is also recording this event and will put it on our website and on our YouTube channel, and can send it out to people who participated, especially for people who are in other time zones at the moment and can't attend today in person. So Congo's Cobalt, in everything, everywhere, all the time. The Oscar-winning movie that inspired this title was a comedy or a comedy drama. But today's event is not about a comedy. It is about a tragedy, modern slavery, wrapped in a broader tragedy of Congolese modern political economy, wrapped in what we call the global digital economy. I read an article about this topic today which used the line, the black face behind green energy, which seemed very appropriate for what we're going to discuss. And the mineral in question is cobalt. And the modern slavery that produces much of the world's cobalt, including tens of thousands of child laborers, connects every one of us to what is happening in far-off Congo. And this is the topic of today's event. We will discuss the wonderful, disturbing book, Cobalt Red, by our guest Siddharth Kara, and how rich countries, including Australia, where many of our listeners are from, are implicated in modern slavery. And I'll draw on insights from our second guest, Claire Harris. This event is sponsored by HandUp Congo, a small non-government organization based in Australia, but with members around the world. You can see from the poster behind me, our logo. So HandUp Congo was created 18 years ago to make a difference to the health and well-being of Congolese communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that ranks at the bottom of the United Nations Human Development Index. This African proverb sums up HandUp Congo's belief in the power of collaboration. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The event is taking place during Refugee Week in Australia, and this is a good opportunity to remember that many artisanal miners in Congo have been internally displaced due to ongoing civil conflict in that country. There are also artisanal miners from Angola, many of whom came decades ago during that country's Angolan civil war. One of HandUp Congo's partners is the Association of Emergency Medicine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, known by its French acronym, the AMU-RDC. As our guest Siddharth Kara points out in Cobalt Red, artisanal mines have an appalling record of accidents and safety. Injured miners do not always make it to hospital, but if they do, they will be treated by a member of AMU-RDC. HandUp Congo is working with this organization to improve emergency medicine, and funds raised from today's event will go to this organization. We'll now show you a short video introducing AMU-RDC and its work with HandUp Congo. In the video, watch out for our volunteer, Dr. Grace Mano. She is an emergency medicine physician who was delivering training when the video was made. And I'll hand over to you, Fergus.
I am Dr. Diulu Kabongo. I am an emergency physician. I'm a Congolese by nationality. I'm an emergency physician trained in South Africa. I am the sitting president of the Emergency Medicine Association of the Congo, MAURDC. We are a professional body of everybody who likes emergency medicine. We are a member of the African Federation of Emergency Medicine. So we mainly advocate for adequate emergency care in the Congo. And therefore, we are involved in many activities, but particularly for this fundraising, we hope to fund two of our activities, a congress that we organize in August, and training in short courses. The training in short courses is essentially an adopted 5-day course of WHO that will essentially help clinicians to know how to approach resuscitation of adult children and trauma patients. For this particular medical education is important in the DRC because the DRC faces a lot of health issues, and many of them because of delay to attend to hospitals, arrive at hospitals and need resuscitation and needs clinicians that are able to do resuscitation. However, in DRC, emergency medicine is not well developed, including in undergraduate. Students don't get that course. So we want to offer them those skills and knowledge to attend to these patients.
Thank you, Fergus. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Siddharth Kara and Claire Harris. Siddharth Kara is the author of Cobalt Red, How the Blood of Congo Powers Our Lives. And I have a well-read copy of it here. Cobalt Red has had nothing less than a spectacular debut, very well deserved, and has been reviewed around the world. Siddharth is a researcher and activist on modern slavery and is a British Academy Global Professor and Associate of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery at Nottingham University. Siddharth has authored 3 books on modern slavery and won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Kara's first book was adapted into a Hollywood film, Trafficked. A feature film inspired by Cobalt Red is currently in pre-production. Our second guest, Claire Harris, is one of the foremost researchers of modern slavery in the Australian context. She's worked on the implementation of ethical sourcing in supply chains over 10 years, with a particular focus on electronics, fashion, and fresh produce. Claire was a researcher and co-author of the Ethical Fashion Report and Electronics Industry Trends Report at Baptist World Aid Australia. These reports rate the efforts of companies to address modern slavery risks in their supply chains. Claire is currently researching and writing a PhD at the University of Wollongong on sustainability and modern slavery in the chocolate industry. And I have my prop for Claire, which is a chocolate box from Leonidas, which those of you who know Europe and North America is a popular chocolate chain here. Siddharth, I'd like to bring you in here and start by asking you an initial question. What told you that you were onto a profound story about the world today? That is the role of modern slavery and child labor in supply chains for electronic devices, especially their batteries. And I guess that's really a question about your E.D. Morel moment, the backstory to you writing Cobalt Red.
Well, first, let me say thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening and to share this conversation with Claire. And thank you to HandUp Congo for sponsoring this important convening of ours. You know, I had been researching slavery and child labor in dozens of countries around the world for, at the time, 17 or 18 years. And a few colleagues started talking to me about cobalt, and it's in the batteries. This was probably 2016, 2017. And I didn't know anything about cobalt. I thought it was a color. That was the extent of my knowledge of what cobalt was. But they were painting a fairly grim picture, but one that was also very much under-researched. And I planned my first trip in 2018. It took some time to establish ground relationships and figure out how to get into that part of the Congo and do research effectively. And I thought, as I was going there, You know, I had seen a lot about slavery and child labor, some pretty horrific things. And so I thought I was prepared for what I would encounter. And it was really just that first visit out to an artisanal mining area in the Congo that was that moment, because it hit me like a thunderclap. The conditions I saw were so bleak, so degrading, so dehumanizing, so miserable, so toxic. It felt as if the clock had been dialed back 2 centuries to colonial times, that I had been time warped back to Leopold's Congo, the Congo that Morel and Casement and others worked so assiduously to uncover and then to address and to bring down this genocidal profit-mongering regime that King Leopold had erected. I honestly thought I had been time warped back to that period, because the conditions in which people were working and living were just echoes of that. The only difference was, instead of measuring their lives in kilos of rubber, as they did for Leopold, they were measuring their lives in kilos of cobalt. And instead of for a king of a country, it was for kings of industry. But the rest of it was the same: the degradation, the exploitation, and the utter grinding poverty that people were living in. And then I knew this horror was repeating itself, and a new wave of truth-seeking and campaigning for human rights needed to address it.
Actually, one of the things that really struck me in the book is that you really establish the historic precedents, and that this is really a continuum. And I wonder whether how much you knew at the time in 2016 about Congo's history, or it just got you reflecting and therefore doing more research and bringing it together. Because I think you've really done this terrific job of saying this is not something new in terms of systemic exploitation and the kind of conditions and the benefit of people who live far outside Congo. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I guess that's the historical links and context.
Well, that's the great tragedy. Is it's not what's happening in the Congo right now is not an isolated ad hoc incident. It's simply the latest chapter in a very long, unholy tale of foreign pillage and plunder of the resources and people in the heart of Africa. And prior to my first trip, of course, I read up on Congo's history to try to understand the place and the people. So I read about the colonial period. I read about Leopold. I reread Heart of Darkness. I think everyone reads that at some point in college. But I reread it with a different kind of understanding. And then when I went there and saw what was happening, then I feverishly dove into Congo's history, because, as I said, I was literally gazing through a time warp, and I realized that nothing had changed except the year on the calendar. At least for the people of the Congo, nothing had changed except the year on the calendar. They were being subjected generation after generation to this plunder because they happened to be sitting on dirt that is teeming with riches. And from one industrial development after another, first it was the first automobile, which needed rubber tires, and they had the biggest rubber rainforest at the time. And then on through the industrial period with the need for copper, and they're sitting on massive reserves of copper. And as you just go decade after decade, generation after generation, it's just this repeated story of what Conrad chronicles in Heart of Darkness, this enormous colonial pillage and plunder that unleashes a horror on the people living there. And the latest chapter in that story is Cobalt, which feeds into all the batteries that we're using at this very moment to have this conversation.
Yeah, actually, so another thing that really struck me as well is that in the book you wrote like repeatedly and very passionately and frustratedly about efforts to prevent you going to certain places and seeing certain things. So really being blocked by a system of permits and soldiers and police and bureaucrats and company officials. And this seemed to be symptomatic of a general desire by all involved. It's this great irony, because everything there appears to be happening very publicly, and yet there's this desire by people not to talk about it, and particularly a desire by the renewable energy sector to obstruct transparency, because with transparency comes accountability, and with that knowledge, there's a necessary acknowledgement of fact, which makes it hard to escape the conclusions that there's this participation by the digital global economy in the modern slavery that's occurring. So can you tell us a bit more about the impediments to your research, I guess including silence from technology firms, if that's the case, about what appears to be this willful ignoring of conditions by those firms?
Well, the truth is not supposed to come out. That's the nature of the business right now. And that's been the nature of the slave economy going back centuries. It's meant to be shrouded. The truth is meant to be obfuscated with these ridiculous fictions told at the top of the chain that, even back in the day, hundreds of years ago, the slave owners would talk about, no, the Atlantic crossing is very pleasing for the Africans. They play games of chance and have ample room on deck. And the working conditions in the West Indies are very pleasing. And we've saved them from being eaten alive in the dark continent anyway. And this is the story that was told to people who would say, oh, okay, Duke so-and-such is saying that, so that must be true. But it took truth seekers to bring light into the bottom of the chain. Back then it was the sugar economy, to say, wait a minute, that's not true at all. In fact, this is a horror that's taking place and being unleashed on the people of Africa. And so in a sense, rinse and repeat for today. There's a horror taking place in the Congo, and it's not meant to emerge. And so as I tried to move around the mining provinces, which are heavily militarized, heavily secured, whether it's informal militias, which is chaps with machetes and AK-47s, or the army or the Republican Guard, there's a real restriction on access into mining areas. So it took quite a bit of time to build trust in communities and get into these mining areas to bear witness to what was happening. And that's where the truth is. And the truth that's revealed is completely opposite to what's told at the top of the chain. The top of the chain will tell you right now, no, the conditions in the mines are not that bad. There's heavy equipment, and it's not done by child labor. It's not done by artisanal digging techniques, and our supply chain is clean, and there's no children inside so and such mine. And you think, oh, okay, well, maybe it's not Earl this and that, but it's CEO something or the other is telling me this, so that must be true. And then on the ground, the truth is there are thousands of children inside the mine, and there's no industrial equipment. It's all being done by hand. And they're not doing it sustainably. They're polluting the environment, dumping toxic effluents into the earth, air, and water. They've clear-cut millions of trees and not replanted one. And so then there's this disconnect between the story that's told outside and the truth. As difficult as to access as it may be, eventually truth emerges. And the truth is we're pursuing our sustainable environment and important climate sustainability goals through this transition to EVs by destroying the environment and the people in the heart of Africa. And that's not acceptable. That's a hypocrisy. People aren't willing to engage on it. They're hoping the truth remains shrouded, but Cobalt Red has brought the truth as testified by the Congolese people to the world. Other journalists are doing the same. Other NGOs are doing the same. And eventually, just like Leopold's Congo, there'll be a moment where a critical mass of humanity says, I've become aware of a horror, and this will not stand, and some community of conscience will band together and drag the rest of humanity forward with their force of will and their moral authority to set this injustice right.
Actually, that's a great segue to my next question, because reading it, I did what's probably a natural response. So, I read the book and I was horrified chapter by chapter. And then I started thinking about solutions, and I was really struck by a very firm recommendation that the first step really is about involving Congolese voices as the critical first step. Can you tell us more about that? Because you wrote about that very powerfully towards the end.
It's one of the most frustrating experiences I've had in 20 plus years of working on slavery and child labor is when you get to that moment where people start to talk about solutions, and then everyone at the table has never even stepped foot in the place that they're talking about. And no one at the table is actually from the place that they're talking about. And those voices from the ground, the survivors or whoever it is, are not included. And so you think this isn't even really a genuine effort to address the problem. It's just an effort to show that we're trying to do something for the sake of it. So the Congolese people know what they're facing, and they know what is required to help them. It shouldn't be me telling anyone what's going to help the people of the Congo, or anyone on this conversation, unless they're on the ground as Congolese people living that experience, because they know exactly what's happening to them. They know the truth. They can speak their truth, and then suggest and say, this is what will help us. And it'll be very clear. It's been articulated very clearly to me what those steps would be. So including the voices of the Congolese people in this case, in efforts to design and deploy interventions that will address this horrific injustice they're enduring, that's a very important step. And it's been an important step throughout the history of slavery. The authenticity of that voice, whether it's Oluwada Equiano's narrative as the first published narrative of a former slave back in 1789 that brought authenticity and truth to the experience of slaves, or Frederick Douglass's narrative in 1840 something, someone can look it up, in the United States. And those voices are the authentic voices that have to be included and brought to the forefront. And the same is true now. The average person living in Katanga province, in the mining provinces of the Congo, does not have a voice at all. They're screaming into an abyss. They're screaming multi-generational torment and trauma into an abyss, because we're all too busy looking the other way and charging forward with our lives, and no one's listening. I mean, HandUp Congo is listening, but the broad population of the planet's not listening. And this is what's important. Every one of us right now cannot function for 24 hours without the cobalt that's being scrounged out of the ground in the Congo. So we can't function for 24 hours without participating in the enormous suffering of the Congolese people. And that's why it's important we hear their voices and include them in efforts to address these injustices.
Thanks. Actually, Claire, I'd like to bring you in here, because you've done a lot of work on the problem of modern slavery and supply chains that reach into Australia. And similarly, I'm sitting in Canada. And can you tell us, from the perspective of a wealthy country, thinking about all the things that could be done and assuming that people are starting to listen to the voices of the people who are directly implicated, what are the pieces of the puzzle that we need to understand to start addressing the problem of modern slavery?
For consumers or companies? I think what we're trying, what Siddharth's book is doing so well is getting the voice of Congolese to regular consumers, hoping that consumers provide the pressure on companies, right? Because ultimately it's the companies that are consumer facing in the supply chain that are responsible for the cobalt they're buying. They can't sell their product without it. There's nothing that says they legally need to do more than what they're currently doing, but obviously human decency says that this is not acceptable. There's plenty they can do. The first thing would be looking into their supply chain. Obviously, electronic supply chains are huge, they're complex, there's lots of components, there's lots of companies involved. And that complexity is what the companies are currently hiding behind as an excuse for not going and finding out where their cobalt comes from. The unique thing about cobalt and the Congo is that we know from Siddharth's book that 75% of the world's cobalt is coming from the Congo. So it is undeniable that cobalt is present in every single device, just because the percentage is so high. Normally with issues like this, companies can hide behind the complexity and say, oh, our people are good people, probably not in our product. But in this case, it's undeniable that every single large electronics company is buying Congolese cobalt and making a profit of it. So the first thing they could do is start to look into it. The complexity of the supply chain is real, but it's no real reason. It's not an insurmountable obstacle to finding out where the cobalt comes from as a first step.
And can I ask, not necessarily just with mining, but with all sorts of products, I know that you've worked with the private sector a lot, and in various sectors. So when you tell corporations that there is or there could be a problem with modern slavery in their supply chains, and when you explain what it is, what the phenomenon is, what's their reaction? What do they say? I'm just interested, like, as a personal response. How do they respond to that?
There's a lot of denial. There was a lot of, when I started researching on this topic 10 years ago, there was a lot of denial. People would say, no, I work with good people. They're good people. They wouldn't hurt anyone. And there's almost a willful blindness to the problem. But also with a bit of persistence and treating people with respect, you can gently start to open their eyes, point them to other resources that show the hidden underbelly of the supply chain. It's quite nuanced. Someone could be in a situation of modern slavery or bonded labor in front of you. You could be talking to them in a factory and never know, right? Let alone the modern slavery that exists in a mine at the far end of a very complex multinational supply chain. I think a lot of that battle of persuading companies this is a real problem has been won, at least in Australia. We now have a Modern Slavery Act. There's a law that says every single business that has a revenue of over $100 million a year has to put out a public statement every year saying what they've done to look for the modern slavery risks that might exist in their supply chain. That has been written to be open-ended so that they are meant to be looking all the way back to their minerals suppliers, or at least open to those risks, even if they don't know what they are in the first year. There's now a law that says they have to go looking, which is something we've never had before 2018. Companies have an obligation to go looking for these risks, whereas previously they never had to do anything. So we've kind of won what had previously been a debate on, does this risk exist? Do companies have to do anything? And now the debate sits around the question of what is the extent of their responsibility, particularly for issues that are far removed from their immediate contractual relationships in the deeper tiers of a supply chain.
Okay. And can you tell us, in the Australian context, not necessarily for mining, but for any sector, what is working in terms of eliminating products produced being modern slavery? Do you have any examples of that? Examples of positive change?
So, okay, great. So our fashion research we used to do, when we first started, most fashion companies were in denial about whether there was a problem in the fashion supply chain. We all know fast fashion heavily relies on exploitative labor. And we all know that there are other environmental impacts from dyeing that might happen in a fashion supply chain. There is now no major fashion company in Australia that's doing nothing on the issue. Whereas when I started, it was like pulling hen's teeth to get companies to talk about what they were doing. The short answer is consumer action has a huge impact, especially if it's coordinated, especially if there's a risk of there being public exposure. We know from other research that the risk of reputational damage is the single biggest motivator for companies to start to take action on modern slavery. In every company, there are good people wanting to do good for a company doing good, but ultimately, the research shows that it's that risk, that reputational risk, that will get boards to start investing in ethical sourcing and in sustainability concerns. One example that I had was there was we were meeting with the CFO and ethical sourcing team of one medium-sized Australian menswear brand. And we were telling them how much, as in my position working for an NGO lobbying companies, we were telling them, oh, customers care about these issues. You've really got to invest in it. And that CFO, that company had actually gone and invested in ethical sourcing far above what they were disclosing to their customers. And they told me that they took it so seriously. Every time a customer emailed them about ethical sourcing, that email was personally answered by the CFO because he took it so seriously. And he was so disappointed he'd only ever received 3 customer emails on the issue because he had a story he wanted to tell to his customers. And that company they weren't out there as a particularly socially progressive, responsible brand. They just happened to take it really seriously. So my point being that customer emails, maybe to a battery company saying, hey, I have children, I go through a lot of Energizer batteries. What do you do about cobalt sourcing? You might be surprised that will get to the desks of people more influential than you expect.
Actually, that reminds me of a story. I once went into a shop and was about to buy a work shirt. And I noticed it was made in Burma, Myanmar. And I said to the woman, I can't buy this shirt. There are sanctions on Burma because of the conditions of what the people are going through. This was a few years ago. And she stopped dead in her tracks. And I think she'd honestly never had anybody comment on where any garment sold in the shop was made, let alone object to it. And she kind of looked really puzzled and took the shirt back. But it made me think that she would always remember that. And she would also always remember Burma, Myanmar after that, and would hopefully tell her boss that this weird guy came in and said he couldn't buy a shirt because of where it was made. And it made me, I guess, think of your example that we can feel like there's nothing much we can do. But in fact, we can send emails and we don't always know what the outcome is going to be. But you've given that example of senior executives in a company that I guess effectively they see it as partly a business tool, right? They can create a business case around saying we're better than competitors because we do not have modern slavery in our supply chains.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. Can I just say on the flip side of that, they are all positive examples from electronic fashion. When I was researching electronics companies the following year, so around 2017, literally the period of time Siddharth was talking about going to Congo in 2018 and seeing the extent of the artisanal mining and child labor. Every major electronics company I met with in 2017 was doing nothing on cobalt. We were asking them about other conflict minerals, like the coltan that you've written about, Michael, or the gold or tantalum and tungsten. They were taking action on tracing those supply chains and trying to figure out where it was coming from and maybe better ways of doing it, but they were still in the very early stages, but not a single one was doing a single thing on cobalt when I was meeting with them back in 2017. Not to say there isn't hope for future action, but we're starting from behind. They're behind the start lines. Yeah.
So actually, I think we can go to Q&A now, but I really wanted to open up with a question to both of you, so Siddharth and Claire. So the question is, I'd like to ask you both, and it's a question that I asked myself as I read Cobalt Red, and also when I bought chocolate after talking to you, Claire. So you both research and write about modern slavery, and you have a much greater understanding than the rest of us about the issue, but you're also consumers who live in wealthy countries in the modern world. So how do you make sense of your own position? I guess it's like, how do you situate yourselves ethically in relation to the problem? Because it's something that I really personally grapple with. Siddharth, perhaps if I start with you.
It's a very good point because you know, as researchers, we're very intimately and in some cases viscerally aware of the kind of suffering that goes into so many of the things we consume every day, whether it's the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the shampoo we use, or our gadgets and electric vehicles. And it's very challenging because there's really not much by way of reliable, good resources that would help a consumer make an informed choice. When you get to that moment where you think, okay, I want to buy the t-shirt that I know was not made with child labor, or I want to buy the electric vehicle that I know does not have cobalt from the Congo, mined by children, and on down the list. I mean, it's very difficult, unless you just sit back and take the word of the company that they say, oh, it's okay. It's very difficult to make an independent, informed choice as a consumer, and that's part of the problem. Because consumers can wield, I think, important market power by making choices, informed choices to purchase and consume goods that weren't made through forced labor, child labor, or unsustainable practices. And oftentimes, even the labels that are thrown on certain things aren't worth more than just the plastic they're printed on, because they're just that and nothing more. They've been reduced to sort of marketing tools without actually having the substance of reliable, durable, authentic, independent certification taking place on an ongoing basis. So right now it's hard for consumers. And I think every person has to make an individual choice about how they consume. For me, for instance, after going to the Congo, you know, I've made choices that I don't need to upgrade my phone every year just because some company tells me the phone, the camera has another megapixel on it, or the processor is 5% faster. It still works. I don't need to upgrade it, because every time I do that, I'm introducing more demand into the chain. The EV choice with Cobalt is a harder one, because we've been marketed this idea that if we buy an electric vehicle, we're doing something good for the planet. And at one level we are, but not for the part of the planet where African people are living, not for their communities, not for their environment. And so that has to get sorted out. And there's nothing a consumer can do directly about that other than to agitate. And as you mentioned, write letters, write emails, organize awareness campaigns, and agitate to demand that EV companies in particular get on the ground and sort out the bottom of their supply chain, because none of them have seen fit to do that as of yet.
Actually, Claire, I'd like to get your personal response, but I know you also mentioned earlier just about I forget the exact title, but like the chocolate index.
Yeah. Oh, so the research I'm working on in the chocolate industry is a corporate benchmarking tool which compares chocolate companies. The website is chocolatescorecard.com. It covers chocolate available in Europe and the US and Australia. They get awarded a green egg if they're good and a rotten egg if they're terrible, or a cracked egg if they don't participate in the research, I think it is. The intention being to drive a rate, like about highlighting good practice, driving a race to the top, pushing that consumer demand in the direction of highly performing companies, putting a bit of pressure. We're not trying to publicly shame poorly performing companies. We're actually very relational about trying to engage with them to get them to improve, because we're not interested in destroying companies. We want them to be as good as the best companies in the world. So in terms of chocolate, that's what I use to decide what chocolate brand I'm going to buy. It's my favorite food. Working in the social justice space, we all need to get joy where we can. So I don't need to miss out on my favorite food when there's better choices available. But in terms of the rest of my spending, I don't have a perfect answer. I'm not a perfect consumer, but I am a pain in the butt about it. Like, I research as much as I can. And the short answer is there's no perfect choices, but you can try and be as intentional. I don't upgrade all the time. I try and buy secondhand where I can. I want there to be less demand on consumption in the economy, because that's the kind of world I want to be living in for both human rights and environmental reasons. And because I buy as much as I can secondhand in that economy, then when I have to buy things new, I make considered choices. I buy well. Sometimes that involves spending more. But if my laptop lasts me 9 years because I spent a bit more, I think it all comes out in the wash. I have no interest in making anyone feel guilty about their choices. The people profiting off the trade in things like Cobalt are the large multinational companies, not me as a consumer. So my responsibility extends to making the best choice I can at the time, but still buying the product I actually need to solve the problem. So I'm not then buying another product later. There's no point being guilty, buying the wrong thing and then having to go and buy a second device because you bought the wrong one in the first place. Right. Make the best choices I can. And then if I happen to have the time and I email a company and I respectfully say, hey, I buy your product, I'm a loyal customer, I really value this, I know that that has just as much impact as my dollars.
Okay. Actually, there's a question from a participant, and Claire, it's really about what you've been saying. So can you say which groups, this is from Sandra, which groups, companies or agencies in the US are doing work similar to what you're doing in Australia? Do you know? There's
an organization called Know the Chain that looks at Know the Chain. They look at responsible sourcing of electronics. They focus on their resources on investors. They're trying to leverage investor funds in the direction of more socially responsible electronics companies. They don't specifically look at just cobalt. They look at minerals more broadly than cobalt, as well as conditions in factories. But if you're looking for like a ranking tool that says which electronics companies are better, I would point to that one in the United States. Do you have any, Siddharth?
No, the chain is a good resource for people to go to, definitely.
Yeah. And I guess this is for both of you, and this is from Libby. How are companies looking for modern slavery risks? So what are they doing? Like what do they do to try to identify that? And do you know of any progress that's being made to address the risks that are identified? You mentioned a little bit about chocolate, Claire, but part of the question was what laws or government bodies are auditing these activities? And is there a role for our global regulators here? So I guess that's like quite a broad one, for both of you. Siddharth, perhaps if you go first.
This might be a better question for Claire, because I think she's probably dug into this more than I have. But I mean, the short answer is companies don't do enough. Nor do governments do enough. They do much more than they did 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago, but it's still not enough. I think Claire mentioned the Australia modern slavery law. There's a range of laws now that include reporting requirements around supply chain auditing and standards, and they tend to be reporting requirements. So if you're a company of a certain size, you need to report what you're doing to be aware of your supply chain, to address any issues you may uncover. There's not too much in most of these laws by way of penalty or real consequence or teeth that would act as a motivating stick for a company to really dig in and figure out their supply chain and address any injustices they may uncover. I think the tussle is that, if companies were going to really take accountability for their supply chains all the way down to the bottom, which they should, if they were going to do it of their own accord, they would have done it by now. And so it does require some regulatory pressure, some consumer pressure, some NGO activism to find ways of motivating companies. And some sectors have moved further along than others. Apparel has moved along. Cocoa, again, is another one that's moved along further. Seafood is moving in fits and starts. But then there's others that are just still at the behind the starting line, and cobalt and battery component metals are one of them. And so it's going to require more pressure from all stakeholders at various levels in the chain, be they government, policymakers, companies, consumers, activists, and so on.
Okay. And Claire?
In Australia, so we have the Modern Slavery Act, and that really is just a first step. And it won't be the final thing the Australian government does. In New South Wales, where I live, we now have an anti-slavery commissioner. So there is someone who's a part of the government, but it's a he this time, but where it was previously a woman, is able to commission reports and research, question the modern slavery statements that companies put together, he can both advise government on their public procurement, as well as start to question other large companies about the extent to which their efforts are good enough. And we have had a change of government in Australia in the last couple of years, and it was part of the Labor Party's platform that they would be introducing an anti-slavery commissioner federally in Australia. And we also know there is movement towards, we don't yet have it, a forced labour bill that will start to ban goods that are imported known to be associated with forced labour. The first version of the bill was a private member's bill introduced by a senator who I don't think is currently in the Senate anymore. That bill that did have a lot of support was specifically focused on Uyghur forced labour from China, but it looks like Australia in the next couple of years will end up with a forced labour bill with a broader focus, which is why we don't have one yet. There's some movement in that space. It's very much a wait and see, but there is very good reason to believe there will be tougher regulation on Australia, limiting goods brought into Australia where they're known to be associated with forced labour. Actually, the question remains to be seen if cobalt will fall into that category. It's very much a wait and see, watch this space situation, but there are reasons to be hopeful.
Yeah. Actually, I'd like to pick up on that because Australia has a modern slavery law, which sounds great, but I know that getting those kind of laws in place, let alone having somebody who can audit what companies are actually doing, there's a huge amount of work behind the scenes that happens. Can you tell us much about I guess like in 60 seconds, the history of that law, like which parties put for it? Was it lobbying by civil society? Or was it, community action groups, international development organizations?
There was lobbying for a modern slavery act for years from activist groups and NGOs in Australia for a long, long period of time. And what was exciting to me was when I started working in this sector, it was inconceivable that we would end up with a law like this. 15 years ago, when I was a little keen law student, passionate about this topic, reading Michael's book, writing an honours thesis about conflict minerals, my supervisor, every time I met with him, would tell me there are no laws on this and there shouldn't be any laws on this. And it was an uphill battle for me just to write a thesis saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if there was regulation in this space from like a senior member of the legal community? It was inconceivable 15 years ago that there would be regulation in this space. And now there is regulation. It's now accepted as the bare minimum that companies have to do something. So a lot can change in 15 years. Is what I'm trying to say. There were activist groups pushing from multiple sectors. And then it also got to a point where the companies that were out ahead of the market, so for example, the chocolate companies that have been working on the problem of child labour for 20 years since they were first publicly shamed for the child labour that exists in cocoa supply chains, they were out so far ahead of the market that they were also in the government hearings as to whether we should have a modern slavery act. They were saying, hey, we should do something about this. And apparel companies that, again, they'd been publicly shamed for the last 20 years and taken significant investments into ethical sourcing. They, in those meetings with government, were also saying, hey, we're investing in this and other people who are doing nothing are making it look like they're doing something. And so companies that are like I'm talking about, Nestle gets a bad rap a lot. Their statement to government was saying, hey, we should have a modern slavery act because we want everyone else catching up to where we are. So there was business support, there was NGO support. The Modern Slavery Acts were introduced by Liberal governments, which you would not have expected in the Australian market, to be honest. And yet the exact party that we would not expect to want a business to be regulated more were the ones responsible for passing those bills. So they were passed with bipartisan support.
Yeah, which is a real achievement. Yeah. And Siddharth, there was an interesting question here really about this same issue of what governments could and should do. So the question was about one of your earlier comments, really looking back at Congolese history and the role of different regimes in either turning a blind eye or in fact facilitating, possibly through willful neglect. Can you talk a little bit more about governments and what you think their responsibilities are? Because climate change is a global phenomenon. A lot of the digital economy is really concentrated in certain countries, the United States, but also China, Japan, Korea, Germany, either through processes or manufacturing. And like, if you step back and look at what governments could or shouldn't do in their own responsibilities, what could you tell us about that?
Well, I think it's governments from the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. Their responsibility is to put some moral boundary on capitalist endeavor, because when you just take a hands-off approach, we know what the outcome is of unregulated or underregulated extreme market economy principles. It's that those with power, resources, and capital pillage and plunder, enslave and exploit those without. And that's how it all started centuries ago, and that's how it proceeds. And then you have these sort of waves of this forceful thrust of horror and exploitation. People become aware of it, they clamor, and then governments stick a boundary, a moral or ethical boundary on the commercial sector. And then the commercial sector adapts. So the original slave trade was, let's take Africans, cart them across the Atlantic and put them to work in the colonies. When that got dealt with, okay, let's just enslave the Africans where they are. So then Europe went and colonized Africa. And then you had a new freedom movement, and governments had to come and regulate commercial activity. I mean, it started with things like the Royal Africa Company, the East India Trading Company. These were all, capitalist endeavors that had to be regulated. And so now you have multinational corporations that, as Claire rightfully notes, have these complicated multi-transnational supply chains with 5, 10, 15, 20 levels and layers in them. And that convoluted structure is used as sort of a shield to against accountability. Well, how for the company at the top of the chain, how am I supposed to take responsibility for what my 8th level degree subcontracted producing wholesaler supplier partner is doing? And if they tell me everything's okay, then surely it's okay. And so then that just again leads to this forward thrust of exploitation, whether it's children in South Asia weaving the shirts we wear, or children in West Africa picking the cocoa beans we eat, or migrant workers picking the avocados that we enjoy, or children digging out the battery component metals. And so now it's going to take governments to regulate that and stick a moral boundary on that activity and say that's not acceptable. And you mentioned Uyghur goods in China, and there's been this very sort of uniform response in the West to take a stand on that here in the United States. There was a bipartisan law that said, okay, solar panels made from Xinjiang province cannot enter this country, because the presumption is it's derived from forced labor exploitation of the Uyghur community. We don't even need to go there to take a look ourselves. There's just so much evidence. We're taking it as a given and prohibiting those goods. Now, if you did something like that for electric vehicles and smartphones or whatever, I promise you those companies would stand up and take note and get on the ground in the Congo or wherever else the metals are being mined and deal with it, because everything would grind to a halt. But that's a policy lever. That's government putting a moral boundary on the import of goods made through child labor or forced labor. And those laws exist on the books in some countries, certainly here in the United States. They just need to be enforced which is always the challenge. It's easy to write things on paper. It's much more difficult to actually implement them in the real world. And so that's the role of government, at least what it should be, is to take, especially in the West, to say, listen, we're meant to be beacons of a certain standard of human rights. We've enshrined and codified this in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. This is all a given. Slavery's been jettisoned as utterly repugnant, going back 1.5, 2 centuries. This is what we stand for. We need to continue monitoring and enacting laws and policies that uphold these principles, rather than just be sort of passive, sitting on the sidelines as this sort of capitalist machinery, when left unchecked, will run amok, and it tends to run amok and trample on the people across the global South. And that's been the story and the dynamic going back since the first Europeans hopped on ships and managed to get a little bit south of the West African coast back in the early 1400s.
Yeah, yeah. Are there particular, it just makes me think that, thinking back to slavery, I mean, obviously the British government took a particular stand, although that's often criticized as having been duplicitous given the interests of particular members of the government. But it did actually eventually send out patrols and actively stop slave ships. In modern slavery generally, but also in the digital economy, are there particular governments that are trying to, kind of take leadership on this issue? I guess go Claire for you from what you've seen for other sectors, and then Siddharth for what you know of as well for Congo. And also, where is the role of is there room for the Congolese government? Is room given to the Congolese government to say its piece? Claire, why don't you go first here?
I think the British Modern Slavery Act, which was the first one in the world of its kind, was very influential in there being a Modern Slavery Act in Australia. Their Anti-Slavery Commissioner came to Australia as part of lobbying for Australia to have a Modern Slavery Act. I think everyone in the global economy benefits when companies that have cheaper products as a result of exploitation are driven out of business, and where people doing the right thing are competing with other people that are doing the right thing. So I think the influence of governments is huge. I think we need to think of governments both as legislators and regulators, also as consumers themselves. Public procurement is huge. In Australia, the biggest provider of health care and education is the Australian government. If you were to read the Commonwealth government, and when they wrote the Modern Slavery Act, the Commonwealth government themselves puts out a modern slavery statement. It says front and center, we are a huge consumer of electronics, and we know there's modern slavery risks in the electronic supply chain. They don't hold back. They're not tiptoeing around the issue. Hopefully that means that as the years go on, they'll start to do more. And as from the perspective as being a consumer themselves, as a procurer of goods, governments have influence on supply chains as well. I just wanted to add that bit. They're not only regulators. And again, in our context, they're buying more than almost anyone. So I think governments are looking at each other and learning from the experience of one another. And when you're talking about multinational supply chains, you actually don't need every government to pass a law requiring action in this space, because if you're a multinational and you've got laws in 5 different countries, but you're operating in them all, the whole business lifts and has to operate to whatever the highest standard is between them, because so many resources and systems and processes are shared. So even if we had regulation in key countries, it wouldn't have to be everyone to change the performance of entire companies in their whole global supply chain.
Yeah. Siddharth?
Well, so narrowing that, and Claire's exactly right, but narrowing that to batteries and our rechargeable economy and our transition to electric vehicles, governments are, it's really just not been a story for people to pay attention to, because it was so shrouded for so long. And now the truth is emerging, and governments will have to get involved. And it remains to be seen. Part of the challenge with this particular supply chain is that China controls almost all of it, from the dirt in the Congo all the way to the battery. They have vertically integrated and dominate 70 to 80% of every step in the chain, from the mining in the Congo to the refining in China to the battery manufacturing. So it's difficult for Western governments to actually have an influence on the chain, the levels of the chain beneath the consumer-facing tech and EV companies based in the West. And that's part of the challenge with battery component metals, and especially with cobalt. The US has been trying to create some counter pressure. The Biden administration signed a memorandum of understanding with the Congolese government about promoting alternate battery supply chains and more ethical practices, but there are no American companies on the ground in the Congo. It's almost entirely Chinese state-run mining companies plus Glencore. And so there's not much the US or Western European countries can do in terms of ground conditions. They're reliant on Chinese actors to do the right thing, which is a big ask. And then you asked about, well, what about the Congolese government? And you know, you're talking about a government of a country that is the entire heart of the African continent in terms of geography, with dozens and dozens of ethnic groups, that has a budget about the size of the state of Idaho in the United States, and there would probably be an equivalent in Australia. But just to give an example, the Congo has 50 times the population of Idaho, but the same national budget. So there's just not much by way of resources, capacity, and there's always the issues of corruption and poor governance to deal with. And that's another whole conversation about the post-colonial legacy and what colonialism taught colonies the role of government was. In essence, colonialism taught the global South that government is really an organized system of theft. And so that's what's been reenacted following the post-colonial period. And when there were brave, bold leaders who wanted to use their resources for their people, they were dispatched by the neo-colonial powers of the global North very swiftly, and then replaced with dictators who would just continue playing ball. And that's been the sad story of the Congo since independence.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, one of our participants, Devla, asked the question, and I'm not sure how much you ever looked at this, but you know, I'm sure you're aware of it. There's clearly talk about recycling, recycling cobalt. Would that have a meaning impact for Congo, do you think?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I'll give you the short answer because I know we're running up on time here, but right now, recycling tech is not there yet for the grade of cobalt required for an EV battery. It requires a very high grade of cobalt, and recycling tech is not there to do it or do it at scale. So it's still about yanking the cobalt out of the ground, this feverish scramble that's taking place without moral boundaries, laws, or any care for the human rights and environment of the people in the Congo. It's just pillage run wild. But let's say, for the sake of argument, because this is really what the question is asking, I think, if tomorrow we didn't need any more cobalt from the Congo, we could recycle it or replace it with, you know, tap water, whatever, in the batteries, would that help the people of the Congo? And the answer is, if you didn't need Congolese cobalt for some reason tomorrow, what you would have achieved is 15 years of utter pillage and violence and destruction, and then you just dust off your hands, say, well, that resource anymore. And that's back to the colonial mindset. The colonial mindset is, we need this thing. They have it. Let's go there, take it from them forcibly if we must, violently if we must, destroying their environment if we must. And then when we don't need it anymore, we'll just turn around and walk away. And then you leave behind this complete apocalypse, this human apocalypse. So recycling cobalt does not help the people of the Congo. It may help companies shore up their supply chain. It may help them mitigate risk of requiring cobalt from a war-torn country, and so on and so forth. But it does nothing to bring back all the people who were killed because of cobalt mining. It doesn't replant all the trees that were clear-cut. It doesn't clean up the water, the lakes, the rivers. It doesn't unpollute all of the dirt, the fish stocks, the chicken stocks, and it doesn't repair all the shattered spines and broken legs as a consequence of cobalt mining. So part of this, fine, if you want to find other batteries and other ways of recharging our things, you still have to get on the ground and account for the damage that was done to those people and their earth for the last 15 years before you can just turn around and walk away. Otherwise, we're just saying, okay, this is back to 1785 or 1822, and that's how we deal with the global south.
Yeah, actually, we're running short of time, but I think that's a really good point to end really on the need to amplify Congolese voices and the voices of the people who are actually involved about what they would like. So unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. There are more questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to them all. I'd like you to remember, though, that this session has been recorded and will be posted on the HandUp Congo website as well as our YouTube channel. We would love for you to spread the message about Cobalt Red to your networks, so please go ahead and do that. Also, remember Claire's advice that you can contact companies and ask them about their supply chain as a way of getting them to reflect on how they do business. You can also look up the chocolate. I'm just looking for the link. Well, you can either look up Know the Chain, which is about digital appliances, and also the chocolate scorecard for those particular sectors. Most of all, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guest Siddharth Kara and to Claire Harris, as well as all the people who made this work behind the scenes. Siddharth, I know you're very busy with millions of things going on, and kudos to you for such a wonderful book. In particular, I'd like to thank Fergus Ewington, but also Libby Gunaratne and Lucy Hopgood-Brown, who were part of the organizing committee for today's event. If you want to reach out to Claire about her own work and about chocolate, you can find her on LinkedIn. HandUp Congo loves its members and its volunteers. So if you're interested in our work, please look us up online and contact us through our website. Similarly, if you have any questions for about Siddharth's presentation today, you can contact us and ask us a question which we could forward to him. A reminder that the next HandUp Congo virtual meetup will be on Wednesday, 16th of August, at 10 a.m. London time and Kinshasa time and 7 p.m. Sydney time. So that's Wednesday, the 16th of August. The topic will be on the mighty Congo River, including previous attempts to tame the river and the impact of those attempts on Indigenous communities, as well as an increasing focus on fighting the Congo carbon time bomb. That is, preventing carbon currently held in Congo's forests and swamps from being released through logging, draining, burning, or other development. And with that, we're right on time. I'll thank you and say goodbye, and you are free to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.